will now be an opportunity for silent prayer or meditation. Thank you. You may be seated. The Secretary will read the order of the day.
Debate on Workers' Day, celebrating 100 years of Nelson Mandela, restoration of workers' rights to dignity through the national minimum wage.
Honorable the Minister of Labour, Mildred Oliphant.
Thank you, Honorable Deputy Speaker, honorable members. International Workers' Day, May Day, as it is known globally, is what we are dealing with in this debate. For many of us, this day brings back both bitter and sweet memories. To those who were not part of the struggle against apartheid, you may not fully comprehend the painful joy that filled South Africans on day when the declaration of 1st May as Workers' Day was announced. It is on this day when we are reminded of the pain, struggle, and grief that colonialism and apartheid oppression brought to bear the millions of working class. As we celebrate the lives of Mama Albertina Sisulu and our former late President Nelson Mandela, it is fitting to flag but a few points to ponder as we move forward to the future. The ANC at its watershed conference in Morogoro in 1969 posed a critical question about the role of the working class in the national liberation struggle, and I quote, "Is there a special role for the working class in our national struggle?" The ANC declared that, and I once quote again, "The double oppressed and doubly exploited working class constitute a distinct and reinforcing layer of our liberation and socialism and do not stand in conflict with the national interest. Its militancy and political consciousness as a revolutionary class will play no small part in our victory and in the construction of a real People's South Africa. Indeed, the ANC has stayed true to the commitment to work with the working class in all its efforts to transform this country. You do not have to look further than the spirit and the latter of our labor policies to test this assertion. The ANC recognizes that workers and their trade unions are at the economic heart of our country, and it is workers who mine the minerals and produce the exports that fuel our growth. It is workers who put food on our tables and build the facilities that deliver the services our people need. Without workers' organized participation, our efforts to become more productive and competitive will not succeed, and the International Workers' Day, therefore, presents an excellent platform to commemorate the heroes and heroines who shed blood and lost lives to make South Africa a country that we have to come to know today. South Africa is the only known country within the ILO family of member states that has labor rights enshrined in its constitution. It is also not a small feat to note that 2018 is also 22nd anniversary of the Labor Relations Act, which significantly changed the labor relations landscape in South Africa. We are truly proud of the contribution of our toiling masses. The ANC government has strived to create an enable environment for trade unions to operate in order to advance the interests of their members, whilst finding the delicate balance so as not wreck the economy in the process. We truly believe that the actual job in advancing sound industrial relations and collective bargaining is best left to trade unions and the employers. Ours is that of creating an appropriate labor legislative framework.
Sorry, Minister. Honorable members, can we lower our voices, please? We are conversing too loudly. So can we give a hearing to all speakers? Proceed, Honorable Member.
Ours is that of creating an appropriate labor legislative framework tools and institutions to support and promote this important work. Honorable Deputy Speaker, the Freedom Charter has remained the cornerstone and a point of reference for the ANC government when developing policies. Let me for 1 minute illustrate what I'm talking about by lifting the 5 Freedom Charter core demands around promotion of decent work, which are explicitly captured in our labor laws. The Freedom Charter states, then I quote, "All who work shall be free to form trade unions, to elect their officers and to make agreements with their employers. Workers shall draw full unemployment benefits. Men and women of all races shall receive equal pay for equal work. There shall be 40-hour week work, a national minimum wage, paid annual leave and sick leave for all workers, and maternity leave on full pay for all working mothers. Minors, domestic workers, farm workers, and civil servants shall have the same rights as others who work," close quote. ANC government has pursued these fundamental workers' rights through inter alia, the Labour Relations Act, which is the centerpiece of our labor laws in South Africa, and it advocates profound democratic elements in its architecture as it recognizes, among other things, that collective bargaining is the most acceptable means of resolving disputes of mutual interest and provide the means to reach agreement between those disputants. It recognizes that strikes and lockouts are an intrinsic part of the process of collective bargaining. The Basic Conditions of Employment Act, which seeks to advance economic development and social justice by establishing and enforcing basic conditions of employment. It also gives effect to and regulates the right to fair labor practices as contained in Section 23(1) of the Constitution by establishing and enforcing basic conditions of employment, including covering the country's obligation as a member state in the United Nations itself and the International Labour Organization. The Employment Equity Act, which provides strict prohibition of discrimination in the workplaces, as an obligation on employers to review all policies, procedures, and practices that have a degree of unfair discrimination. On Occupational Health and Safety Act, which to make provision for the health and safety of people at work and in relation to their use of operating equipment and machinery. Compensation for Occupational Injuries and Diseases Act, which provides compensation to be paid to workers who, as a result of their activities at work, are injured, partially or totally disabled, or contracts occupational diseases. The compensation fund step in as the medical aid and pension fund for workers who get injured in the line of duty. When it comes to the Unemployment Insurance Fund, an unemployment insurance scheme which pays out benefits to workers in the case they lose their jobs, which includes benefits to prolonged illness, maternity, adoption, and unemployment benefits. You are also aware that we have since submitted in this August House the National Minimum Wage Bill, which concludes our mission in terms of fulfilling all aspirations of our people as enshrined in the Freedom Charter and our Constitution. Whilst the introduction of the national minimum wage may not mean a lot for those who are well looked after in their world of work, the majority of the vulnerable workers, in fact, over 6 million of them, the national minimum wage will make a huge difference. We all agree and mindful of the fact that the proposed national minimum wage is by no means a living wage, but for all its intents and purposes, it remains as an important and timely policy intervention. It also augurs well as a tool to promote social justice, which has remained a pipe dream for many. It is also important to note that the 3 labor federations in South Africa, that is COSATU, FEDUSA, and NACTU, supports the proposed level of 20 Rand per hour as a starting point, and are happy to let the National Minimum Wage Commission provide expert advice on whatever adjustment that may be necessary going forward. Let me point out that reaching the point where we are today on the National Minimum Wage Bill was not a rushed overnight process, but it took us well over 3 years. The journey of the national minimum wage starts with the Freedom Charter, where it states, as I've quoted previously, that there shall be a national minimum wage in a democratically governed South Africa. To give effect to this demand, the 2014 ANC manifesto directed the ANC government to investigate the modalities for the introduction of the national minimum wage as one of the key mechanisms to reduce income inequalities. The journey to transform the labor relations in South Africa has not been an easy one. Unless we choose to forget, some of you will know how difficult it was to obtain infamous work seekers. You will also recall that before 1994, a farm worker was not recognized as a worker, as such could be dismissed summarily without a notice. The ANC government has made sure that workers in these sectors are very least guaranteed minimum wages, which are set by the sectoral determinations, a far cry from what the case in the past. Today, over 4.6 million workers are dependent solely on the ministerial sectoral determinations for their minimum working conditions, a living testimony that the ANC cares for the workers.
Your time has expired, ma'am.
Thank you very much, Deputy Speaker.
Thank you. Honorable Bagram of the DA.
Deputy Speaker, we are here today to celebrate May Day and freedom under Labour. It is with a heavy heart that I need to say that the Labour freedom was short-lived. Today, 1995, under the wisdom and guidance of President Mandela, we hailed the implementation of our Labour Relations Act in a plethora of forward-thinking laws. However, since the implementation of these laws, we have gone backwards. In this very parliament 4 years ago, the president of the ANC, and unfortunately of the country, President Zuma, announced the government was going to create 5 million jobs. President Zuma was notorious for his inability to understand mathematics and counting, and we have already seen a steady destruction of losing 5 million jobs. Our labour laws have acted as a handbrake to job creation, and the Labour Regulatory Authority appears to have done everything in its power to not only cause our workforce to dwindle, but to stop businesses creating more employment positions. Today, we have over 9.2 million people unemployed, and we are about to embark upon disastrous legislation which will cause at least a further 750,000 jobs to be lost. The Treasury tells us that they can forecast these losses, so it ill behoves us to have and to say the unintended consequence. Although there are some progressive and forward-thinking imminent changes to both the Basic Conditions of Employment Act and the Labour Relations Act, the overall import of the changes will be negative. It doesn't help to have some of the best and innovative laws in the world if these laws are not going to have the effect on those at the workplace. We have over 16 million employed South Africans today, but we have only 1,200 inspectors from the Department of Labour. These inspectors are underpaid, overworked, under-resourced, and invariably small businesses with all sorts of pressures don't even know what the labour laws are, and the majority of our workforce is not unionised. All the labour federations acknowledge that their numbers are dwindling, and that the unions confirm that their reach into the small business sector is minimal. Our labour laws can be compared to a brand new, beautiful, shining car which has no engine and no driver. Our government's answers to its inability to enforce the law is merely to make more law and to make the regulations more onerous and complicated. There is no incentive for anyone to even consider the implementation of these laws that we already have, let alone the new laws and the burdensome regulations we are about to face. When a staff member is first engaged at the workplace, the very basis of our labour legislation requires that that staff member receives a letter of appointment or a contract of employment. From that contract, the rest of the rights flow in terms of the implementation of the Basic Conditions of Employment Act and the Labour Relations Act and many other pieces of labour legislation on our statute book today. When we inquire as to how many workers in South Africa do actually have letters of appointment or contracts of employment, we are astonished to see that thousands upon thousands of our workers don't even have that simple document from which enforcement of their rights flow. Unfortunately, the message that we're receiving from employers is the same. Hundreds of companies tell us they have difficulty trying to register for workmen's compensation and UIF. Many more tell us when they try and claim from workmen's compensation and UIF, they hit a dead end. The most vulnerable in our society are those who have been injured at work and who are unable to continue working. They have insurance for which they handsomely pay every month. This insurance supposedly is there to compensate them for these injuries and to pay for their medical expenses. Only last week I received a further 27 complaints of claims that have been outstanding for years, sometimes for decades. These complaints are a drop in the ocean as I receive regular daily pleas from those very vulnerable people who are left bereft and non-functioning. Despite the fact that we have insurance which is heavily resourced and overfunded, they receive nothing. I've just read an application to the High Court where the applicant is seeking to have a warrant of arrest put out on the Workmen's Compensation Commissioner. One can only shudder at this abuse when in fact the PIC is holding billions of rands in reserve to enable the Commissioner to pay out our injured workforce. The real elephant in the room is the ongoing mismanagement of just about every section of our Department of Labour. We have just had current feedback from the Auditor General who talks about material non-compliance, irregular expenditure, inadequate contract management, wasteful expenditure, lack of skills at various levels, high number of fraud cases, financial management investigations, duplicate payments made and loans issued to medical service providers in prior years not recovered, and many recent suspected fraud incidents. I can go on and on. However, there's a culture of poor performance and weak internal control. It is horrific to read about the lack of urgency and commitment to improve the control environment, which may lead to increased instances of fraud and could have negative impact on delivery. All this when the service delivery is at an all-time low. It should be pointed out that there's some existing hard-working staff who are probably overworked and who often get discouraged and eventually leave the entity or adapt to the culture of poor performance. We have entities such as the Compensation Fund who keep purchasing IT systems but somehow never integrate them properly or learn how to use them. It should be mentioned that the Commission for Conciliation, Mediation and Arbitration, the CCMA, is the one sparkling jewel in the broken crown of the Department of Labour. The CCMA has managed to a large degree to try and keep labour peace. Unfortunately, we're going to see this jewel have its shine taken off within the next year when the burdensome national minimum wage lands on its lap. The CCMA's performance has been sterling, but they're running at full capacity with their budget utilised to the fullest. The CCMA investigated its workload and has been conservative in stating that its workload will increase by over 30% with the advent of the new legislation. There is no budget earmarked for this increase, and we're over a year away from being able to train commissioners to handle the tidal wave, the tsunami of referred disputes. NEDLAC, the toy telephone, spent over 2 years debating the national minimum wage and its modalities. Many of these issues are going to have enormous effect on the unemployed in South Africa and the future dwindling workforce. There is no voice for the unemployed, and there's certainly no thought with regard to job creation. This is the true story of a rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic. As talk shops go, NEDLAC is good for those who are entrenched in the workplace and seen as the labour aristocracy. Even now, when a new trade union formation seeks place at the table, the greedy wolves around the table at NEDLAC are trying their utmost to deny them a seat. It is really rich to see that the Auditor General has raised a concern about HR management at NEDLAC. It would be laughable, as these are the very people who purport to guide human resources in South Africa. Over and above this, enormous levels of concern have been earmarked within NEDLAC, such as management, procurement, contract management, performance management, financial management, oversight and monitoring. They've been warned they're about to face an audit failure. Collective bargaining in South Africa is about to take another knock with these future amendments, where the Honourable Minister may extend a collective agreement where either employer parties or big trade unions are representatives. In other words, big business, big trade unions will extend agreements to destroy small business. There are some positive amendments, and we need to applaud for that. Finally, the provision for a secret ballot is intended to ensure that the individual
Honourable Member,
members...
your time has
I
expired.
thank Honourable Ollis for that secret ballot proposal. Thank you.
Honourable Noluchungu.
In celebrating the Workers' Day, we're also celebrating 100 years of Nelson Mandela and the restoration of workers' rights to dignity through national minimum wage. To be a worker in a ruthless capitalist economy here in South Africa and anywhere in the world, and in particular to be a black worker, is to defy death on a daily basis. To be a black worker, you cannot choose between being alive and proud or be dead or not care, because you are bound to death as long as you are dehumanized, treated as an object, and paid a normalized slave wage. To defy death on a daily basis is only to postpone what cannot be avoided, as all workers are death-bound subject of capitalism. Nelson Mandela and his fearless generation of outstanding Pan-Africanists understood these relations between workers, death and exploitation as the reason for brutal land dispossession of black people, to force millions over many generations into slave wage, work in mines, farms, factories, and white people's kitchens, leaving women and children landless, homeless, workless, and with no income to sustain and build decent lives, which is why we cannot separate the indignity of black workers from poor black women, children, and people living with disability. The murderous, sexist, criminal, and exploitative capitalist economy did not allow workers their humanity and dignity. Celebrating 100 years of Nelson Mandela, his legacy, and his call for our generation to rebuild a truly equal society in which we live humanized black workers requires true commitment to uplift workers from poverty, slave wage, and indignity. The introduction of a national minimum wage must go beyond the narrow purpose of establishing a minimum floor wage below which no worker must be paid. The motivation for such a socio-economic policy instrument must be understood in a context of more than 100 years institutionalized slave wages, which have condemned black workers and their families to abject poverty and unimaginable misery. First and foremost, the underlying motivation for a national minimum wage is to reclaim black workers' dignity as a human being and then as a worker. Secondly, a national minimum wage must deal with the legacy of apartheid, a structural economic crisis responsible for budget cuts, high interest rates, rising inequality and poverty. 20 rands per hour proposed national minimum wage is a spit in the face of workers by the ANC government and must be rejected. The EFF calls for land expropriation. Thank you.
Honourable Mgwezi.
Honourable Deputy Speaker, yesterday South Africa celebrated Workers' Day with much pomp and ceremony, yet in reality the workers in this country have very little to be cheerful about, and even less so the unemployed masses, all of whom this government appears to have forgotten. It is a sad fact that 39% of all currently unemployed people in this country have never had a job. Youth unemployment sits stubbornly at 60.3%, which is a national tragedy, and is chronic in the extreme even when compared against other African countries that are classified as upper middle income countries. This is further exacerbated by a demand for prior work experience from both government and the private sector, and this must be addressed so as not to allow a stagnation of our learners who find themselves in an academic postgraduate limbo for not being able to complete a postgraduate internships. Annualized unemployment in South Africa is 4.8%, which is double that of the employment growth rate, which is currently at 2.4%. If this trend persists and no corrective action is taken by this government, the National Development Plan goal of reducing unemployment by 6% by 2030 will be a total failure, as the reduction will be wholly unattainable. Labor broking in South Africa should be abolished, as the tripartite nature of employment agreement provides many loopholes for easy termination of service without exploring other avenues for maintaining the working relationship. For those fortunate enough to have employment, the national minimum wage proposed by government, which is currently at 20 Rand per hour and proclaimed widely as a living wage, is in reality far below the daily expenses of many workers when one takes into account daily transport cost and subsistence provision. This living wage, as proposed, Honorable Deputy Speaker, is nothing really but a poverty wage, and the IFP remains of the firm contention that when in addition to this we have a 26.7% unemployment rate in the country, there is nothing to celebrate in South Africa on Workers' Day. Yesterday, the IFP, led by His Excellency the President of the IFP, Prince Mangosuthu Buthelezi, marched upon the offices of the Minister of Labour in Richards Bay, where a list of demands were handed over to the minister's representative, and possible solutions were presented that the IFP feel, if implemented by government, would have a significant impact in reducing unemployment in the country. The IFP will continue to champion the voice of equal, fair opportunity for all South Africans in the workplace. Thank you.
Honorable Kubisa.
Honorable Deputy Speaker, honorable members, once again today we are engaging this House in a very important topic, a twin stream theme, which on one hand deals with the celebration of Madiba's 100 years, on the other hand, the restoration of dignity brought to the workers through a minimum wage. The National Freedom Party hold in high esteem the role Madiba played in the struggle for liberation in our country and the ushering in of a new democratic dispensation in our country. Now, the second stream of the debate deals with a very critical matter, which is meant to impact 30 million South Africans who face the brunt of abject poverty and live under the conditions of squalor. The national minimum wage model is a very important instrument for South Africans, but it's important that for us to say that working for a pittance of 160 a day and 20 Rand an hour is not good enough. However, the narrative should start from somewhere. We don't have to close the debate. We must say that we need to engage social partners at NETLEC even further to move closer to the decent national minimum wage, the wage that is meant to alleviate poverty whilst at the same time takes into cognizance the economic position of our country. Workers have been manipulated and abused for a long time. We need to say to the domestic workers, farm workers, petrol attendants, security guards, etc., you have to get more, and the government must do more for you to get more. The underlying fact is that we need to close the gap in our country, the poverty gap in our country. We're a country where the rich becomes richer and the poor becomes poorer on a daily basis. According to the data given by the World Development Report 2019, South Africa would need 7.9% of the GDP to close the poverty gap, whilst countries like Chile and Indonesia would require an average of 8.7% and 4.5% respectively to close the poverty gap. Further, on behalf of the NFP, we want to state categorically that the questions of poverty, illiteracy, landlessness, and the vast structural inequality that characterize our country must be factored in a discussion like this one. It has been found that taxi drivers, domestic workers, etc., are unaware of the developments around the minimum wage bill. We seem to be late starters. For instance, the question can be asked as to why a discourse on a matter of such magnitude was only started 2 or 3 years ago. If we started, for example, in 1994, we would be at a point whereby we're amending the already existing act to cater for the increment on what would have been decided regarding what the minimum wage should have been then. In conclusion, Deputy Speaker, it is important that we move far beyond rhetoric in order to ensure that we bring about dignity to the workers who have to sell their sweat and energy for almost nothing at the end of the week or at the end of the month. They deserve to be paid a decent wage. Thank you very much.
Honorable Kwangwa.
Thank you, House. Thank you, Deputy Speaker. While we welcome the debate around establishing a minimum wage for our people, we must say that the proposed 3,500 rands per month does not go far enough. Throughout 2017, the public was made to believe that the national minimum wage is going to be 3.5 per month, but the bill makes it clear that there will be no monthly minimum wage, but rather an hourly rate of 20 rands. Workers will only earn 3,500 if they are able to work a 40-hour week. However, large sections of the labor workforce find it difficult to secure a 40-hour week of employment. Subcontracted workers and workers in short-term contracts often work variable hours and are therefore unlikely to ever earn the 3,500 rands per month. The 20 rands hourly wage represents a possible advance for some workers who only earn below 20 rands an hour, but is deemed already to be a working poor wage. Furthermore, the national minimum wage is set at a level that is far below what we would consider to be a living wage. The national minimum wage, what we must talk about now, is that cannot be viewed in isolation or should not be viewed in isolation from the inability of the Department of Labor to enforce labor legislation. For instance, the proposal for the Commission for Conciliation, Mediation and Arbitration to have a bigger role in enforcing labor disputes will only be a failure if the CCMA is not capacitated to handle such a volume of matters effectively. Due to the failure of employers to comply with labor legislations, the CCMA will become increasingly burdened by their added responsibility, which the Department of Labor will be shifting over to them. The CCMA currently receives about 1,000 cases daily, and we reasonably estimate that the 20 million rands added to their budget will not be sufficient to deal with all the labor disputes. This shifting of the burden from the Department of Labor to the CCMA will create even dysfunction or dysfunctionality in the CCMA itself. Another concern that we have as a party is that the National Minimum Wage Commission is said that it is not required to adjust the minimum wage, but only required to review it annually. This therefore means that the minimum wage may be left unchanged for a long period of time. The UDM therefore recommends that we review the powers of the National Minimum Wage Commission to propose adjustments to the national minimum wage rate. The Minister of Finance must also be obligated to consider the recommendations by the National Minimum Wage Commissions. In addition, the Minister of Finance must be able to do what the Minister of Finance in Britain does, be able to adjust the hourly rate for inflation during budget speeches in order to align it properly with inflation. Siyabulela.
Honorable Alberts.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. The idea of a national minimum wage, like many other ideas to create a more equitable world, is a noble notion. However, it will remain a mere notion if the policy is not aligned with reality, and unfortunately, it is not. Vele studies van reg oor die wêreld is al gedoen oor minimumlone, selfs deur die Wêreldbank, en telkens word daar bevind dit is minder skadelik en meer uitvoerbaar om die ekonomie te groei ten einde enerzijds werkskepping te vermeerder en anderzijds lone te verhoog. Die voorvereiste vir ekonomiese groei is in wese om vryheid te verhoog, en hoe meer markvryheid bestaan, hoe kleiner word ongelykheid. The effect of the national minimum wage is going to be tragic and will not result in an upliftment of workers in a sustainable manner. In reality, the following will take place. It will lead to job losses in those sectors where the poorest are employed, like miners and farm workers. They will unfortunately be replaced by machines. It will lock the unemployed completely out of the market, out of the labor market, as few new entry-level jobs will be created. The positive effect of the higher income of workers will be neutralized by higher consumer prices as businesses pass that higher labor costs on to consumers. And lastly, some businesses will simply uproot and re-establish themselves in friendlier business environments. The national minimum wage, together with expropriation without compensation, will lead to further disinvestment in South Africa. In teenstelling sal 'n vrye mark met laer belastingkoerse meer beleggings na ons land toe trek, soos die FSA tans gewys het. Firmas sal meer belê en dus sal meer werk geskep word. Ongelukkig, soos die gerekende ekonom Mark Schuster sê, het Suid-Afrika van die beleggingsradar afgeval. Netto buitelandse investering was in 2017 minus 30,9% geweest. Dit beteken ons belê meer oorsee as wat die buiteland in Suid-Afrika belê. Die Suid-Afrikaanse skip lek beleggingskapitaal en dit vernietig werk en hoër salarisse. Geen minimumloon kan hierdie probleem eintlik herstel nie. The 25 largest countries achieve on average net foreign direct investment of 30%. If we can achieve that, it could mean up to 3 million new jobs. This can halve the unemployment rate and reduce inequality substantially and lift salaries as well. But clearly, the government is looking in the wrong place for real solutions. Real solutions cannot be found in good intentions that flounders in the real world. Die formule vir welvaart is wel bekend aan ons en aan die wêreld. Ons moet dit net instel en gebruik. Die instel van 'n minimumloon in 'n omgewing waar disinvestering baie plaasvind op die oomblik is ongelukkig 'n radikale afwyking van daardie pad. Ons moet 'n ander pad volg. Thank you.
Honorable Dongwana.
Honorable Deputy Speaker, honorable members, I am going to outline the South African process of arriving at the agreement reached in NEDLAC on the national minimum wage. The African National Congress has a tradition of representing in government the aspirations of South African workers and other progressive strata. This tradition predates the 1994 democratic breakthrough. The ANC embraced the Reconstruction and Development Program, the brainchild of COSATU. Our icon, President Nelson Mandela, championed the RDP as the program of the ANC. The national minimum wage is one among many campaigns initiated by the organized working class that the ANC, as the true home of workers, has supported in government. The 11th National Congress of COSATU, held in 2012, resolved to campaign for a national minimum wage. This decision was consolidated by the Federation's collective bargaining and campaigns conference held in March 2013. Through engagements between the ANC and COSATU, we included the national minimum wage in our 2014 election manifesto. This matter was discussed in a NEDLAC Labor Relations Indaba in November 2014. At this meeting, the then Deputy President of the country, President Cyril Matamela Ramaphosa, recommitted government to implementing the national minimum wage. The Indaba agreed that all parties, government, labor, business, and community should urgently engage on the details. A task team was established under NEDLAC, and it started its work in early March 2015 and was instructed to make recommendations by July of the same year. In the same period, Germany, Europe's biggest economy, adopted a national minimum wage in July 2014. The Confederation of German Trade Unions had struggled for years for the minimum wage. From May 2015, all the trade union federations in NEDLAC called on workers to give mandates from the factory floor. These mandating processes covered a broad range of issues for debate, including questions about what the national minimum wage would mean for collective bargaining, whether it would not result in job losses, what the actual figure would be. South African workers work long hours, but their wages are far below the median wage figure of 3,033. A national minimum wage which would be pitched significantly above the level of the current median wage would immediately raise the incomes of workers at the bottom half of the wage structure. Based on international experience, the minimum wage would also put pressure on companies to reconfigure the wage structure over time, to reduce the proportion of income of high earners in top positions. We have never been under any illusion that 20 rand an hour constitute a living wage. However, the NEDLAC agreement would lift 6.6 million workers who are currently earning below this immediately. As the President pointed out on May Day in Nelson Mandela Bay, I quote, "Even as we were negotiating this, we knew this is not a living wage, but we said that we need to form a foundation so that we can keep going up. The struggle for a living wage must continue, but we must start somewhere," close quote. In February 2017, the National Minimum Wage Agreement was signed by all stakeholders except COSATU, who needed to report to its Central Executive Committee before they could sign. The opportunistic political parties and some Johnny-come-lately trade unions have made calls to workers to reject the national minimum wage. Thankfully, the largest trade union federations, FEDUSA and COSATU, have pointed out the misleading and harmful nature of this rhetoric. The DA has voiced its rejection of the minimum wage as it seeks to perpetuate the apartheid low wage regime that has reproduced the working poor for decades. The DA's Federal Congress last month adopted a resolution to allow employees to voluntarily opt out of the National Minimum Wage Agreement. Workers who have voted for the DA in the past need to seriously reconsider their choice in the next election. The EFF and UDM
Point of order.
made absurd statement that the minimum wage will...
Deputy Speaker, with respect, it's improper for a member to mislead the House. No such resolution was ever taken at the DA Congress, and I would challenge the member to provide the
Honourable
proof.
member, not here, not now. Proceed, honourable member.
The EFF and UDM have made absurd statement that the minimum wage will further entrench poverty and inequality without providing any scientific evidence for these claims.
Order.
The UDM is a
Speaker.
feeble attempt to be the mouthpiece of SAFTU, has suggested that the
Honourable
two-year-long
member,
neglect process...
just hold on. Yes.
I just want to ask if the member can take a question.
Honourable member, will you take a question?
No, Deputy Speaker.
No. Proceed, honourable
Stop
member.
talking about
No,
EFF
no,
and things
no,
that you
no.
don't know about.
No,
The
no.
UDM is a feeble attempt to be the mouthpiece of SAFTU, has suggested that the two-year-long neglect process must be restarted in order to accommodate the voice of minority trade unions. We wish to warn our colleagues in other parties and workers in general that SAFTU is using this populist rhetoric to launch its own political party to contest elections. The millions of workers trapped in low-paying jobs cannot wait much longer for the national minimum wage to be implemented. Implementation has been delayed because Parliament has had to consider the submission on the draft bill during the public hearings. The submissions from organized labor included closing loopholes that could make it possible for business to avoid paying the national minimum wage, fast-tracking farm and domestic workers to also earn the minimum wage, and strengthening penalties for business who ignore the law, among other submissions. The ANC is the home of workers, and the ANC will not pander to conservative or populist rhetoric. Ke a leboga.
Thank you. Honourable Madisha.
Thank you. With respect to the question of minimum wage, COPE is very clear. We say, given a decade of poor and corrupt governance, of the reckless management and rampant organized looting of our fiscals, of a failing education system, of the wanton mismanagement of our economy for ideological and narrow ends, and of the destruction of conditions conducive for investor confidence, we are in a cycle of economic stagnation that breeds unemployment, poverty, and inequality. According to the World Bank, 62% of South Africans are either chronically or transiently poor. If we were to have made a significant impact on unemployment, we should have created 1 million new jobs per annum. Only less than 3 million new jobs were established over the past 15 years. During the same period, some 8,300,000 matriculants left school, and they are not employed anywhere at all. In fact, since 1990, employment in mining has fallen by almost 30%, and in manufacturing by in excess of 25%. It is a fact, I must say, that unemployment rate in South Africa today stands at beyond 40%. As matters stand, the average South African is getting poorer, whilst our political elite is caviar and sushi daily. It is the ruling party that is the creator of this unnecessary catastrophic state of affairs. The real and lasting solution lies in creating the right conditions for economic growth and job creation. As we today stand here and talk about 20% per hour, we are not raising the fact, but COPE wishes to do that the President of South Africa earns 1,732,000 rand per hour. 1732, not, I must say, 1652. He earns 1,732 rand per hour. Apart from the matter of a minimum wage, COPE calls for the consideration of the inclusion of the right to decent work within our Bill of Rights. I wish to emphasize that very many people of our country are not even getting a salary, but what they are getting in cafes, in restaurants, are tips. And yet here, a president gets all that kinds of money. We are in trouble.
Honorable Madisha, please, man. Please, man. Go ahead, Honorable. Ujilana ko tsamondula fa tsintate man a se believe.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. Deputy Speaker, the ACDP recognized the vital role that the national minimum wage can play in reducing poverty and inequality. And whilst it might be less than an ideal living wage, it is to be supported and has been widely acknowledged as an important intervention to assist low-paid workers, and if properly implemented, has the potential to lift the earnings of literally millions of low-paid workers. Now, Fiducia's Dennis George has said that it as a trade union is keenly aware that the 3,500 a month minimum wage is less than an ideal living wage, but will certainly lift an estimated 4.5 million workers currently earning below that amount out of abject poverty, and that must clearly be supported. And of course, the further aim will be also to elevate domestic worker and agricultural sectors to be on a par with the national minimum wage within 2 years of the implementation of the Act and after due research by the Commission. And on the other side, employers will be able to apply for an exemption similar to the sectoral exemptions that can presently be applied for in terms of Section 50 of the Basic Conditions of Employment Act. Now, various challenges and concerns were raised during the public hearings, and the ACDP would like to question the one issue relating to NGOs, particularly those NGOs performing state functions and the impact that a national minimum wage will have on them, as mentioned in the bill. The early childhood development sector is an example where NGOs receive a grant from the Department of Social Development to provide those services. And in 2013, yes, that was 5 years ago, the average salary was 1,373 Rand, which is deplorably low, but without proper coordination across government and possible increases in the grants from government, these NGOs will be unable to pay their staff the minimum wage. Now, the Shukumasi coalition of NGOs working in the social care sector warned MPs about the impact that this will have on many of their members and on the potential closure of services meant to protect the most vulnerable, including children and youth. And clearly, we in the ACDP share those concerns and trust that those concerns are being addressed in this bill. We also believe that if widespread fraud and corruption in the public sector is addressed, this will unlock more financial resources to enable the 20 Rand per hour even to be increased, and for the extended public works program also to be included, which only allows 11 Rand per hour at this stage. So whilst there are various challenges, it is incumbent upon us as Parliament to finalise the bill as soon as possible to alleviate the poorest of the poor. I thank you.
Thank you, Honourable Swart. Honourable Jafta.
Thanks, Chair. Nearly 96 years ago, the Rand Rebellion inscribed unmitigated revolution in the struggle of workers' rights. About 400 workers participated in the strike, which culminated in 7 workers losing their lives. Honorable Chair, as early as 1922, it was clear that the edifice of labor relations was uneven. This episode is a replica of modern South African paradox. Our economy is growing at a snail's pace, and our debt to GDP ratio is expected to stabilize at 56.2% in 2023. The Stats SA survey on poverty trends in South Africa between 2006 and 2015 is a clear indictment of the working class. The survey reveals that 55% of South Africans are living below the poverty line. Honorable Chair, we are cognizant that since 1993, VAT has not been adjusted. However, we don't support the scapegoating of poor and the middle class to clean up the leak-spiegel of corrupt politicians. The struggle of the workers is amplified by our domestic challenges. The NDP identifies these challenges in the following. I quote, other weaknesses in the South African economy include extreme pressure on natural resources, energy constraints, special misalignment, and limited access to large markets because of geographical distance, close quote. Honorable Chair, it is glaringly evident that when labor is not organized, the plight of the workers worsens. Trade unions, federations must have the interest of the workers at heart. The investment schemes that trade unions have stake in must be in complete fulfillment of the workers' struggle. The debate on the national minimum wage must be carefully measured, empirically analyzed, and practically enunciated. We propose that, going forward, the proposed minimum wage must be benchmarked against the profits and headline earnings of the companies. Honorable Chair, we argue that the trade unions' investment shares must target ordinary employees. The time has come that we insulate the workers against exploitation. I thank you.
Thank you, Honorable Jafta. We now call on Honorable America.
Thank you, Honourable Chair. The proposed national minimum wage will become one of the biggest barriers for any unemployed person in South Africa to find a job. Young and old will have no bargaining power to sell their labour. This proposed national minimum wage and other labour legislation will protect the employed. There will be no protection for the unemployed. The reality is that the only way to reduce unemployment is by employing the unemployed and allowing them a chance to enter the job market. The only person who has the right to decide on the level of his wage is the unemployed. Nobody speaks on behalf of the unemployed. They are voiceless, abandoned by government, and dependent on others. The Democratic Alliance believes that we need to grow the economy. If we are to absorb the millions of young people who want to work but cannot find employment, the quarterly labour force survey tells a sad tale of a country that is failing its youth. 63.9% of people between the ages of 15 and 24 are unemployed. 42.8% of people between the ages of 25 and 34 are unemployed. Every young unemployed person deserves a chance to access the educational and job opportunities that are available in our country. Young people in poor communities face a number of obstacles when it comes to accessing jobs. They don't have the same social networks as young people in wealthy areas, and they often don't have the money to access the internet to search for jobs, to print out CVs, and to travel for job interviews. The ANC is failing our youth. Therefore, the DA pledges its commitment to assist young disadvantaged South Africans in finding work. By introducing a job seekers allowance of 150 Rand per month for all unemployed young people aged between 18 and 34. Secondly, rolling out a national job centre project where unemployed people can access job vacancies, undertake online courses, and get assistance in preparing job applications or receive employment counselling. Thirdly, by introducing a national civilian service to provide work experience for thousands of unemployed matriculants. And fourthly, provide incentives to businesses who employ more young people and those who find themselves in long-term unemployment. Madam Chair, noting that the national minimum wage will be bulldozed through Parliament by the ANC majority, the DA strongly believes that law should not prevent people from earning a living on their own terms. Over 9 million of our people experience long-term unemployment. They tend to earn less once they are unemployed. They are in poorer health than those who have avoided unemployment. Therefore, the DA will introduce various incentives and exemptions for employers in order to give unemployed people who have been unemployed for 12 months or longer access to job opportunities and work-based training, skills training. Madam Chair, the Western Cape government continuously expends all its energy to create an environment for investment and job creation. The Western Cape currently records the lowest official unemployment rate of 19.5% compared to the national rate of 27%. It is clear that this government, in the face of the severest and longest drought on record, continues to create a resilient provincial economy by prioritizing job creation, which gives people the opportunity to improve their lives and provide for their families. Madam Chair, the unemployed deserves a break. They deserve the dignity that a job will give them. They need to be heard. Most of all, they need a new beginning. The DA is committed to working tirelessly to create jobs for the millions of unemployed South Africans and supporting legislation that protects vulnerable workers. We pledge to give all South Africans
Honourable Member.
that new beginning in 2019, Madam Chair. Thank you.
Thank you. Volgens is achtbare lid van Skalkwyk.
Thank you very much, House Chairperson. I think the Honourable America forgot to tell the people of South Africa that what the DA is actually proposing is that new job seekers must be exempted from the national minimum wage, which means that they need to earn below the 20 rand per hour that is proposed by the national minimum wage. Honourable Chairperson, to all the workers in the formal and informal sectors.
Honourable van Skalkwyk.
Would the Honourable Acting Chairperson be prepared to take a question?
Honourable Member, are you prepared to take a question?
No, Chairperson.
Thank
to
you.
all the
Continue.
workers in the formal and informal sectors, a happy Workers' Month. House Chairperson, research from reputable institutions like the World Bank, United Nations and State South Africa shows that South Africa ranks amongst the countries with the highest levels of poverty, unemployment and inequality. The South African labour market is still characterized by high levels of these challenges. The triple challenges facing South Africa have their own roots in the apartheid wage structure. The apartheid wages, which are a driver of poverty and household inequality, strip the majority of South Africans, mainly blacks, of their rights to dignity. The ANC's commitment to fight unemployment, poverty and inequality through promoting equality and decent work at workplaces is outlined in its 2014 election manifesto and include, amongst others, the investigation of the modality for the introduction of the national minimum wage. The introduction of the national minimum wage by the ANC Congress-led government, originally led by Honourable President Cyril Ramaphosa in his previous capacity as the Deputy President of the ANC, is aimed at increasing the earnings of the most vulnerable workers and will at the same time reduce the staggering inequality in the country. It will also aim at restoring workers' dignity irrespective of the kind of jobs they occupy, as well as restoring the basic rights of workers. It is known that in many workplaces, especially in the vulnerable sectors, workers are ill-treated and made to believe that the employers are actually doing them a favor to employ them. In many of these cases, workers are paid below the current sectoral determinations. Even though the employers did not apply for exemptions, they are working at slave works without enjoying the basic benefits as currently legislated in the Basic Conditions of Employment Act and the Labour Relations Act. Workers stay under horrific circumstances, as we've seen as the Portfolio Committee of Labour during our oversight visits. South African citizens are also deprived sometimes from being employed to low and no-skilled jobs because employers prefer to employ foreigners who sometimes have no valid documentation and work permits, and they don't apply to South African basic conditions or labour laws, with a threat that if they retaliate, they will be deported to their countries of origin. Honourable House Chair, the principle of universality is central to minimum wage international best practice. While some individuals and organizations may argue that they are not supporting a national minimum wage because the current sectoral determination system is sufficient, it is noteworthy that currently in South Africa, there are approximately 20% of lower wage workers who are excluded from the sectoral determination system. There are industries not covered by the national minimum wage where the minimum wage is as low as 6 rand per hour. Currently, there are more than 40% of workers earning below the 20 rand per hour. That, honourable members, is indeed despicable. If there are indeed employees who cannot afford to comply to the national minimum wage, there is the provision to apply for exemption. There are currently such provisions via the bargaining council agreements as well as the sectoral determinations. This is the most important mediating factor in relation to the risk of job losses. Only a limited number of countries globally who have implemented the national minimum wage allow for exemptions. This practice is allowing struggling businesses a limited period of relief and to avoid workers from being retrenched. There are even some silly examples already being made by even some honorable members with regards to who should be eligible to receive a national minimum wage, referring to people who wash your windows or your car screens at parkings. The ILO Convention 135 explains the purpose of minimum wage as constituting one element in a policy designed to overcome poverty and to ensure the satisfaction of the needs of all workers and their families. More recently, minimum wages have gained popularity as a means to combat wage inequality. The ILO now notes the purpose of minimum wages is to protect workers against unduly low pay. They have ensured a just and equitable share of the fruits of progress to all and a minimum wage to all who are employed and in need of such protection. Minimum wages can also be an element of a policy to overcome poverty and reduce inequality, including those between men and women. The setting of a minimum wage globally has been effective, and when setting at a meaningful level and regularly updated, have significantly increased the wage earnings of lower wage workers. Example, in Latin America, a 10% increase in minimum wages led to an increase in average wages of between 1% and 6%, with low wage workers benefiting disproportionately. Minimum wages help to reduce poverty by boosting incomes. This has been pronounced in developing countries with large amounts of working poor, where many people work and where lower-end wages are near the poverty line. In Thailand and the Philippines, for example, a 1% increase in the minimum wage has been shown to reduce poverty by 0.5%. Stats from National Minimum Wage Research Initiative from WITS forecast for that the poverty headcount is projected to fall by around 2% by 2020. The decline is greater for Black South Africans. A fall in Gini coefficient in South Africa is projected. It is well established that in South Africa, access to wage income and poverty go hand in hand. The average size of a household in South Africa is 3.3 persons, but this differs depending on level of income. Poorer households with an average monthly income of 1,671 rand per month, household size is closer to 5 persons, whereas in a household with an income of 1,671 rand, they are closer to 5 persons. Honorable House Chairperson, a national minimum wage will impact on poverty through lifting the wages of low-paid workers, but not to the extent of increasing it to the level of the living wage. Clearly, a living wage would be preferable, but this is not the level that can be set through legislation. A living wage and a national minimum wage are two quite separate concepts and instruments which some of our honorable members doesn't understand. Minimum wages were set at a minimum level and regularly updated, have directly reduced inequality in the formal and informal sectors across Latin America, Indonesia, Russia, China, India, and Europe. However, the stagnation or decline in national minimum wage levels, like in the United States and Mexico, have contributed to an increase in inequality in those countries. The ANC's most effective weapon in the fight against these levels is the creation of decent work, and this requires a faster economic growth. Honorable House Chair, what we as the ANC are saying is that we know that there are indeed individuals out there that will take advantage of discouraged job seekers, mostly those who are low-skilled and unskilled and vulnerable, and will try to proceed with their exploitative practices while they can afford to pay the required wages. But we are warning them, beware. Justice will be served on those poor workers. They will be informed of their rights and capacitated to fight for their rights. No more can it be correct that capitalism can strive at the expense of the marginalized and the poor. The freedom that many shed blood, lost lives for, and spent many years behind bars like Tata Madiba for, included freedom for workers and cannot be in vain. I thank you.
Thank you very much, Honorable Member. We now close the debate with the Honorable Minister of Labour.
Thank you very much, House Chair. House Chairperson, let me assist the Honorable Member, America, that the ANC government has got programs that will be able to create jobs in South Africa. Firstly, we have the Skills Development Program that is funded through the Skills Development Fund through the Higher Education and Training. We also have the legislation on public employment services, of which it falls under the Department of Labor, where we deal with the issues of counseling for free. And at the same time, we have the Labor Activation Program that is funded through the Unemployment Insurance Fund. And that program was proposed and agreed to by both organized labor and organized business. And also the President has announced even the youth employment services, of which it has started to be implemented in this country. But House Chair, let me explain why we have the national minimum wage. There is a difference between the national minimum wage and the sectoral minimum wages that has been agreed through the collective bargaining. The national minimum wage is to support and strengthen the collective bargaining. So that is the role of the trade unions to negotiate on behalf of the workers. The difference also between the national minimum wage and the living wage. The national minimum wage, we are saying no worker must earn below 20 rands per hour. And the living wage is determined by the conditions of that particular time. That is why we allow the trade unions to deal with the issues of collective bargaining in order to look at the conditions of that particular time. And thirdly, when it comes to the review of the national minimum wage by the National Minimum Wage Commission, they will be also looking at the conditions at that particular time, and they will come up with the recommendations on how we should increase the national minimum wage figure based also on the conditions of that particular time. Honorable House Chair, looking at the minimum wages at a sectoral places based on the collective bargaining, I wish the honorable members can do the research on what has been agreed to through the collective bargaining. For example, in the auto sector, 2 months ago, the trade union who is organizing in that particular sector has signed the agreement where the minimum wage for the petrol attendants is around 17 rands 35 cents. And at the same time, when you look at the auto sector as well, you'll find that the minimum wage based on the collective agreement is only 21 rand 90 cents. When you look at the hospitality industry in this country, you'll find that the workers were being paid through the tips, and when we introduce this national minimum wage, all workers will earn according to the agreed national minimum wage, and the tips will be done as commission for those particular workers. And when you look at the freight logistics, it's only 9 rands per hour. Now, if you are saying we need to reject the national minimum wage, I think you are taking away the opportunity for those workers who will be upgraded to earn 20 rands per hour. And also, let me just say, the decision was not taken by the government alone. The discussions were held at NEDLAC, where organized labor, organized business, community that consists of various NGOs participated, and government. And this is a collective agreement through the NETLEC constituencies. And therefore,
Speaker.
we must take away the notion that is the government that has just introduced or agreed on this particular
Minister,
issue.
you mind to take your seat for a while? Yes, why are you rising, Honorable Member?
I want to ask if the minister can take a question.
Minister, are you ready for a question?
I will take a question if I still have time, but currently I don't have enough minutes. So I have to clarify some of the
Thank you, Honorable
issues.
Khawula. You may take your
There
seat.
are also
House
members
Chairperson.
who are saying
Could I be second in line for a question as well? Thanks.
there are
I
also,
didn't allow you to speak,
there are
so
also
I haven't heard.
members, there are also members, House Chair, who are saying we have refused for the new federation to have a seat at NETLEC. There is a policy that guides on how the federation should apply when they want to have seats at NETLEC. When you look at the registration of the federation that you are talking about, of course they were not part and parcel of the discussion at NETLEC because the agreement on the national minimum wage was signed in February 2017, and the federation was registered on March 2017. So they were outside of that particular space. But at the same time, they have to follow the criteria. What they have to do, they have to submit their membership at NETLEC, but it should be verified by the Department of Labor, and the organizations at NETLEC must also certify themselves that those members are really members of that particular federation. And at the same time, they have to submit their financial statements that are audited. And therefore, based on that, I think they have just finished the year now, then they have to submit all the documents that are needed at NETLEC. And I don't think that there is anyone who will say they can't participate at NETLEC. When you talk about 3,500, I just want to caution the members that in South Africa, in terms of the basic conditions of employment, the workers are working 45 hours a week, of which, therefore, when you calculate the national minimum wage in terms of the figures, it's going to be more than 3,500. And the reason why we have said, let us have a phased-in approach when it comes to farm workers and domestic workers is precisely to allow that gap that the domestic workers and farm workers are earning currently. And by the way, Honorable House Chair, I hope all the members are paying the domestic workers accordingly. And I don't think that you must come in this podium knowing very well that the culprits who are not paying exactly, even in terms of the sectoral determination for domestic workers, and come and claim here that we are exploiting the domestic workers. And also, House Chairperson, I just want to say, when we took this decision, we had workshops, we even invited some countries where the national minimum wage has been established. For example, when you go to Canada, in Canada they have the minimum wage, but it is based on various municipalities and provinces. And in Mauritius as well, it is based on how the municipality is performing. And when you compare our national minimum wage with Brazil, India, and China, we are far better than what they are paying as the national minimum wage. And therefore, what we must understand is that the national minimum wage will be the floor of which saying no worker in South Africa must earn less than that amount. And then where the minimum wage is higher than the proposed national minimum wage in terms of the collective bargaining agreements, that minimum wage will remain as it is. But those that are still earning the minimum wages through the collective bargaining, which are less than the proposed national minimum wage, they will go up in order to be equal with what we have proposed as the national minimum wage. By those few words, Honorable House Chair, I thank you very much, and I've got 30 seconds. If the honorable member can raise his questions.
Honorable Khawula, you are allowed.
Thank you very much. Minister, I hear the point you are raising in terms of the bureaucratic arrangement, that you are saying that SAFTU, as a federation in South Africa, is outside NEDLAC. But the matters that they are raising are matters of a dispute of mutual interest. So if you ignore them, despite the fact that they are now engaged into a rolling mass action, which affects the economy of the country, why would you subject them to a bureaucratic process when they are forming a key stakeholder in the civic society of South Africa? The second other question that I want to raise with you.
The time is now up for you. Can we quickly?
The second question I want to raise with you, there are employers now, as a result of the minimum wage, that are threatening to release employees in the form of short term and also
Thank you very
retrench them with the view of re-employing them on the basis of the minimum wage. What are you going to do that? Because it basically threatens their own lives. Thank you.
Thank you. Come, Honorable Minister.
Thank you very much, House Chair. House Chair, the issues that were raised by SAFTU, their majority unions, which is NUMSA, the officials from the Department of Labor were requested to come and address that union in terms of what is it that we're proposing, and they were addressed, and they didn't raise those questions that they are raising in public. And at the same time, we said those unions that are not satisfied about the processes that happened at NEDLAC, they have the right to come and submit here in Parliament, because public hearings were open to everybody. And I was informed that they did make the presentations here. And if you read the code of good practice that was agreed upon by all stakeholders, the commitments that were made, particularly by the employers, to say they will never retrench the workers based on the introduction of the national minimum wage. If you have that information, I will really appreciate if you can give it to us so that we can make a follow-up. Thank you very much.
I'm very sorry, Honorable Steenhuisen. We actually gave her time to respond, which went beyond. But next time you will have the time.
But House Chairperson, is not fair because the honourable member of the EFF was given 2 questions.
He's the one who asked first. She didn't even respond. Thank you.
If I'd been asked, given my opportunity, asked about the hypocrisy of the EPWP program.
Don't now. Okay, honourable members, that concludes our debate and the business for the day. The House is adjourned. Thank you.